privilege of introducing the speakers today. First of all, thank you for electing me. I was afraid QAnon would come in and saying that climate change does not exist and have their own candidate, but that didn't happen. It's also interesting that Cannon read a poem about snails. I got an article from my brother about the Florida conch, which is a snail, and they're about to be wiped out of existence by climate change. So there used to be just so many of these. They used to get thousands of these snails existed, and they would be harvested. And now with climate change and the over-harvesting of snails, they can't find very many anymore. And there used to be 2-foot snails. It was one of the largest snails in the world, and now they're practically gone. Another interesting article you might want to look on the NOAA website is an article called 5 Lovely Reasons Why We Heart, that's not hate, that's heart, love, estuaries. So I have copies of these. I'll put them up on the table over here, and anyone who would like to read them, please feel free to do so. An estimated 3 billion birds have died since 1970. That's 3 billion, pretty, and that's just birds. We're not talking about all the wildlife that's in danger.
And that was the first Earth Day, 1970.
Yeah, exactly. That's one of the reasons why I'm so looking forward to hearing our speakers today, who have been working hard to develop and restore saltwater marshes where so many birds breed. Geoff Wilson and I have had many a birding walk through Bear Creek Restoration Land in Saugus, along with Soheil, and he has developed, with the support of Wheelabrator Waste Treatment Plant, they developed the whole area out there, Bear Creek. Yes? Okay. Geoff is a man who has great integrity and knowledge, and I have witnessed firsthand the positive results of his efforts, so I thank Geoff for that. Dr. Susan Adamowicz, who is a biologist and expert in saltwater marsh restoration, who, along with David Burdick, director of the University of New Hampshire's Jackson Estuary Laboratory, has been working as a team with Geoff for the past 30 years to develop impaired hydrology projects which change rivers back to their original flows. Going back as far as 300 years, farmers began diverting rivers to obtain water for their crops. But as you know, every change has a consequence, and some changes are not positive. So without any more, I present Geoff and Susan and David. Thank you for coming today.
And thanks for inviting us here today. And it gives me a lot of pleasure to look out into the crowd and see a lot of our birding friends here. And it's going to make this, a lot more comfortable for me. And then if you ask any one of them, they'll be sure to say it's not too much of a stretch of their imagination to think that Sue, Dave, myself, and Ed, we'll throw Ed in the crowd here, are odd ducks. And the reason why we're odd ducks is we'll look out into a salt marsh, beautiful salt marsh, and we'll look past the birds and we'll look past the beautiful green vista. And what we'll see is we see a fluid transfer network. And that fluid transfer network provides the framework for all of the salt marsh systems that we see. And what we'd ask you to do today is to kind of look at the marsh in that framework today, so that you can understand sort of some of the things that we see and some of the areas that we focus on for being hindrances or impairments that are hindering salt marshes adapting to sea level rise. Next slide, please. So about 10 or 15 years ago, there was a national push to sort of assess the resiliency in salt marshes. And so it was a big push, and they checked out a lot of salt marshes. Marshes that we knew were impaired and marshes that we thought were in great shape. And to everyone's horror, we found out that a lot of those marshes were not in great shape. Even the marshes that we thought were relatively pristine, no obstructions, no major land use impacts around it, anything like that. And so Sue, Dave, and I joined up, and we went up to some places up in Maine that had relatively unobstructed flows, light surrounding land use, things like that. And we just took a look to see if we could understand what was going on. And what we found was this repetitive pattern up there. And so when we look at a fluid transfer system, you've got the fluid transfer, which would be the rivers, and then you've got the distribution. So the neighborhood distribution would be the way that the tidal flow permeates up into the marsh, the high plain of the marsh. And what we found was that there were problems in that distribution portion of the model. So where the fluids would go and intermingle across the marsh and come back out. So when you think of a fluid transfer system, a lot of times we think of loop systems, like a HVAC system, or a forced hot water system in your house, things like that. And a Saltmarsh system is actually a different system because the network in is the same network out. And so you've got impairments that could happen on the way in and impairments that could happen on the way out. And if we look at it that way, we can kind of see that these impacts that we discovered could have significant impairments on the way salt marshes sort of adapt to sea level rise. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we thought about with salt marshes is that we know that the ditches weren't always there. They had a natural creek hydrology before the marshes came in. Next slide, please. And then the farmers came in sometime after that. They put ditches in the marsh, and they sort of changed or they altered that natural creek hydrology. And then further along, the farmers came in, and we didn't find this out until recently, but they actually put these embankments in. And these embankments were low earthen embankments that would close off these areas from receiving tide. And then when the farmers sort of left, these embankments and the water control structures and things like that they had involved with those were just left in the marsh, and they failed and they started to clog. And then at some point after that, people started maintaining the ditches again. And what that did is it maintained a 350-year tradition of maintaining ditches, and that sort of obscured sort of the way that the marshes would adapt to any sort of a change. We always saw them as this static system because the ditches were maintained. The ditches were maintained, and everybody thought that was the way that they should be. So on this sort of journey, we looked at these areas that showed the same pattern, and we discovered that it was actually a relic of agriculture that happened. We didn't know then, but as sort of we dug through all of the old agricultural journals, we found out that these impacts started in the 1700s, and then they radically changed and became more intensive and larger in the 1800s. And so when we think of, in that way, now we think of agriculture as having three different eras. So there's the 1600 eras, and that's the ditching that everybody knew about and that everybody's familiar with. And then there's the 1700s, next slide please. The 1700s impacts were that the farmers went out and they created these what we call salt marsh embankments. And essentially it's a low earthen embankment that would reduce the number of tides that would flood the surface of the marsh. And then they had sort of floppy tide gate valves with a leather hinge. And these were created in the 1700s. And essentially all the marshes that way. And then and we can still find them. We can still find them out there today. Next slide. And so when we went out and we looked around, this is what we saw. Next slide, please. So all these areas there, I don't know if you can see it or not, but you've got this sort of this fine grass that goes through the metal with the red lines. And then on the outside of each side there is a darker, coarser grass. Now that darker, coarser grass is actually growing in the depression. And for the last 30 years, we would see areas like this and we misinterpreted them. And we thought that they were an area where maybe there was an old ditch, so that the grass that was growing, the finer grass in the middle down the red line, had better growing conditions, and that's why it was there. But what we didn't realize is when we strip the grass away, it's actually still a 3 or 4 inch rounding sort of embankment that alters the surface hydrology. So when we think of that in terms of networks, right, a fluid transfer network, it's very similar to a data network. So the water comes in, the water goes out in the same network. Just like you have a cable that comes into your community, so the internet cable brings the data in, brings the data back out. Now, what these embankments create is a delay and or an impediment to the transfer of data up in the neighborhoods, right? So if you think about it, if you have an upload and download speed that's really fast, and then something happened to the network and it delayed your upload and download speed by 10%, you can see how that would be a significant impact on just the whole system. And that's what these salt marsh embankments are now creating. And next slide, please. So then, we thought that was bad, and then we found out what they did in the 1800s, which is even worse. So in the 1800s, what it looks like is that they re-ditched the whole marsh. So the 1700 embankments went kitty corner across the marsh, and we can still find those in multiple layers of them, so we know they did it over and over again. These generational farmers, they were always trying to make their fields better. In the 1800s, they said, we've got this new system, and they redid the whole marsh, and they made it the rectangular patterns that we see today. And the system was designed to reclaim the salt marshes and turn it into upland areas. And so there's a number of structures on the inside besides the embankment that are designed to basically drain away the fresh water. The embankment had a really good water control structure called a tide trunk, and that would totally shut the tide out. So these areas didn't receive tide for as long as that embankment system was in place. And then the idea was they were going to turn a 2 to 3 ton per acre salt hayfield into a 4 ton per acre English hayfield, and or they also grew fodder beets for their livestock. So it was a really important area. It was a really important change in their agricultural practices that was very beneficial for the farmers. So when we look back and think, boy, they went through a lot of effort, it was beneficial to them because they thought they were doing this effort and then we're going to hand it down to their ancestors, and there was always going to be a need for that. They didn't, realize that cars were coming along and we wouldn't need all these products anymore. Next slide, please. So we went out and tried to find them, and then we did find them. Next slide, please. And so now we can see that they were actually there all along too. And they actually dovetailed into the salt marsh embankments, which are the red ones. The reclamation embankments are the blue ones. So they're larger, they're still larger. And they diced up the upper edges of the marshes and sort of turned them fresh. And it's basically terraced agriculture. So these fields out with the red lines is slightly lower than the fields with the blue lines. And one of the other things, and Sue's going to talk a lot more about this, is that these embankments and their inner structures have a tendency to cause the marsh surface to sink. And if you notice, on each one of these, each field has an open water area that's associated with it. And we call that the waffle and maple syrup appearance. And it's pretty common. And so those are the major impacts that we see happening to the marsh. And part of why, there's two reasons why they're suddenly visible and suddenly a concern to us. One is we stopped maintaining ditches back in the 80s. So while we were maintaining the ditches, these areas wouldn't waterlog, the grasses wouldn't decline, the surface of the marsh wouldn't subside. We didn't have any idea that that was going to happen. When you stop maintaining the ditches and they start to clog is when these decline cycles start. So that's one factor. The second factor is it's all been accelerated by sea level rise. So if you think of a little dish, it's getting filled more frequently. And these plants, they don't, well, Sue's going to give you a lot more. I'm just stealing your thunder. So I'll next slide, please, and I'll just kind of end that. But Sue's going to tell you a lot more about it. And, so we've worked together as a group, and we've developed a restoration methodology that addresses this. And I'm going to hand it off to Sue. Sorry. So this structure right here is the remnants of a trunk structure that was installed in the early 1800s. And so we find all of this information, a lot of this information in the early agricultural journals.
Were they all wooden structures?
Yeah, so it's all wood. The fasteners are wooden pegs too. And I think they had specific woods that they use, and I'm drawing a blank right now. It's oak and chestnut. So it's kind of amazing. Thank you.
Well, Geoff and Dave are really the experts on this, and so I'm just going to give you a couple of brief slides so that we can spend the majority of time with these rapscallions. I also want to thank you, Belle folks, for inviting us down. It was really great to start to see your marsh in person, and I hope to come back at some point. And I also want to thank St. John's for hosting this meeting today. As you guys know, as you probably know, it's a really busy time in the church's calendar, so for them to be able to host us is a great thing. And I'm ecstatic about the size of your group and the number of people here. I was thinking, well, there might be 6 or 7. So it's very encouraging. And a colleague of mine, and I'm not going to remember all of it, but she on the bottom of her email, she has a little quote from Jane Goodall about why Jane has hope as we're moving forward into this age of uncertainty with climate change and species decline. And part of it has to do with the human nature, and I think your great showing today is part of that reason for hope, that folks are in love with their neighborhood and in love with the marshes around them and the animals that live there. So thank you, and thank you for giving me hope. I'll say when, okay? Okay. So you can go back. So I used to, stumble around in the marshes like everybody else, and literally was blind to what I was seeing. And this would be such a thing, and I'd say, oh look, look at this wet area over here, and I wonder why all the plants died over here, and I wonder why they're doing okay over here. And I would completely ignore this straight line, which of course you're all very smart people, and you can see this right away, right? And it wasn't until Geoff started knocking on my door, it literally took him about 6 months until I could start to see the straight line and what he was talking about. And what he was talking about were these embankments. And now wherever we go, we see these straight lines. And we can put them into a context. And that's the important thing. They're not random. They're part of a system of agriculture. It's documented in these journals from the 1800s largely. And the journal entries are all up and down the East Coast. And we can see these signatures, I think. Well, I can see them down to the Carolinas. Geoff can see them down to Georgia and the Gulf Coast. And the Gulf Coast now. And we know that this form of agriculture, was used throughout the United States as people move west. And I think it has a lot of roots in the area of Norwich, England, the lowlands of England. And I don't know why we didn't think that the settlers, can't really call them colonists in the 1800s, but the early Americans wouldn't be capable or inventive enough to alter these salt marshes to their farming advantage, because we just think back to the Romans and these huge aqueducts and great engineering feats that they were building just to bring water down from the mountains to some other location. It's like, well, it is certainly within the human capacity to alter your environment to your own benefit. And so, yes, now we see these embankments all over the place. And what we also see are these areas of shallow standing water. If you were to step off this straight line into this, what we call a mega pool, it's pretty firm because it used to be growing salt marsh. Okay, the next slide. But we see these all over the place. And this is from the Great Marsh up in Newburyport, Massachusetts, where the Plum Island National Wildlife Refuge is. And what's interesting about these mega pools is, can you see these straight lines? You start looking for them, and they're like freaking everywhere. Right? Just everywhere. If you ever see a straight line in nature, you should be suspicious. And if you ever see a right-hand corner, well, then you're sure that it's human-made. So we began to put these things together, the embankments, the mega pools. There's lots of ditching in these areas. We knew that, the salt hay farmers, of course, left a lot of ditches, but we didn't realize what they also left all these embankments. And now we're seeing they kind of left behind the mechanism for this mega pool formation. When the ditches collapse, they hold back water. And it's like overwatering your houseplant, right? You don't need to overwater it very much before the roots die. We've all done that. Or maybe you haven't, but maybe it's just me. So we know also that if you look at that houseplant, as the plant itself dies, like the soil level kind of drops a little bit in the pot. And maybe it takes a real careful eye to observe that. I've had the chance to observe it many times. But that's what happens over here too. If you hold back water on the marsh, if it doesn't drain well enough during the low tides, then the water will kill off the roots. And when that happens, of course, the plant dies. But when the roots die, the soil just compacts. The roots hold a lot of air, and when they die, they release that air, and the roots and the rhizomes collapse, so the marsh surface collapses. So when that marsh surface collapses, but it's sort of surrounded by these higher embankments, it can hold water. And that's how the megapools form. And if the embankments are all in these straight lines, what we get is this waffle maple syrup model. And yeah, I'm a food-based person, so yeah, I was the one that named that. But we saw this, I saw it, I think, first in Connecticut, and I was trying to describe to people, what it is that I was seeing down there. And it's like, gosh, folks, it's like a waffle holding back that maple syrup. And they're like, oh, I got it. So that's how the name stuck. And then we've got the loss of elevation. And sometimes what will happen is a channel will erode itself from either a natural creek or a ditch, and it will intersect with that pool, and the pool will drain. And in good circumstances, the pool will drain, the vegetation will take off, and you'll start rebuilding that elevation again. Now we got sea level rise and climate change and all that nastiness. And so our concern is that we might not have enough time with rising sea levels to have the elevation rebuild. So what Dave is going to talk about are some innovative techniques that we've developed in order to address this situation. And of course, all of this is happening on the Marsh platform where the farmers were operating. And so that's where this Saltmarsh sparrow that, was it Sean? He was mentioning, that's, you birders know well that that's where that little sparrow guy likes to live. And their nests are right, practically on the marsh surface, so it doesn't take much for them to get flooded out, which is really a very tragic story. So next slide. So this is your marsh, or a portion of your marsh, that I was looking at this morning. And I went to this website, really cool website called historicalaerials.com. This is not the image from the website, but if you go to that website, kind of for free, you can look at all the aerial imagery that they have for whatever's available. And for Belle, it goes back to 1938, which is really cool. Unfortunately, unless you pay a subscription fee, it'll have these big watermarks all over the place. You have to kind of peek through it. But it is a cool site, and anybody can go check it out. You don't have to pay the subscription, you just have to squint. But what was really cool is that, you've got quite some wet areas that have been forming for a while. And it looks like this portion has been forming since 1938. I can't tell you exactly why without having to go and drag these guys out here and do a little site interpretation for me, but I know that this was wet back in 1938, so it's a pretty good sign that it was a megapool formation. involved with those embankments and clogging ditches. And then there's this funky embankment here that appeared around 1955. I don't know what the history of that is. You know, an organization like yourselves might have access to some great historical documents, either from the town or, you know, journals or old photographs of the place that might give us a better idea of when and why this embankment formed. But that's holding back all this water. And Dave is going to tell you a little bit about what happens when you get this bright green algae signal on it. And that's not such a great thing that happens. And then over here you've got a couple of really round pools. Those also appeared on the 1955 image, but it wasn't clear whether they were there in 1938. For a while it was a thing to create these round ponds for ducks by throwing a little dynamite into the Saltmarsh. I kid you not. The Parker River National Wildlife Refuge has a bunch of these on their property near Nelson's Island. And so whenever I see something kind of large and perfectly round that doesn't go way, way back in the history, you know, again, it's a question. You might want to know what the history of that is. And it's, as you can tell, the history is really important because that's how we develop our restoration techniques. I've been assigned to develop innovative restoration techniques as my job. You know, 18 years ago, that's what I started to do. And at first I was really, really scared that I was going to have to come up with all these really cool and unheard of techniques. But really what it is just undoing what people have done before. So that's why understanding history is so vital to developing effective restoration techniques. Okay. And I'm not going to talk about this too much because Geoff has covered it and Dave will cover it again, but this is the megapool trajectory where the peak becomes saturated and the vegetation dies. There's this thing in the Midwest called pattern fens. As you know, like Fenway, a fen is a kind of wetland. So a pattern fen has this, the things are called strings and flarks. So instead of a waffle maple syrup pattern, the string is the vegetated wetland and the flark is the watery area. And I've had that image in my mind for a long time. I spent a summer in University of Michigan Biological Station, tip of the mitt in Michigan, and a colleague was studying pattern fens. And I always wondered if some of our patterns were related to that, and you know, the answer is yeah, probably. So we get in heavily ditched marshes, we have the waffle maple syrup model. It can take 40 years for the peak to break down enough for a channel to drain a megapool. And in that 40 years, you know, we've got 40 years worth of sea level rise. So that's why we think we need to intervene, or we can manage with a really light hand to restore tidal flow. Ever so briefly, I'm going to just mention there's sort of a collaborative, an informal collaborative of a number of us called SMART teams. You have Saltmarsh, adaptation, resiliency, we work together, so it's SMART teams. And the real important basis of SMART teams are what I call field teams. So these are hubs of organizations like yourselves that get together to do projects to restore the health of the marsh. And then all these other folks are advisory or, you know, technical assistance to help you guys get the job done. So Geoff and Dave and I are core members of this design review team where we help various field teams with restoration efforts. Okay. And why work in a field team? Well, as you know, I mean, gosh, I was so impressed by the list of grant proposals that you folks have gotten. It's very impressive, and it shows that there's a lot of hard work and good thinking going on in this group. But field teams, you know, bring together a bunch of different people from different backgrounds. They make it possible to plan large-scale restoration efforts and go for really big grants. It enables an economy of scale. So, you know, the Great Marsh is 17,000 acres, but 5 organizations own about half of that acreage. So it really made sense for the Great Marsh to be a field team. And then we've got a field team, I'll show you in a minute. We've got a number of field teams started elsewhere in Massachusetts and along the East Coast. Okay, next. And the way it works, the Great Marsh is like our oldest, most mature expression of a field team. So it's Parker River Refuge, the trustees of reservations, Mass Wildlife, Essex County Greenbelt, Bear Creek, Mass Audubon. We get these economy of scale, and that means we can restore larger acreage over a shorter period of time. So the restoration benefit is larger overall. And then we can rapidly share the lessons learned. So the design review team is over here kind of helping this group, the core group, and then assisting others. Okay, next. And the field teams, as I said, are scattered from mid-coast Maine down to Delaware, New Jersey. And we've got a new group setting up on Cape Cod, and a bunch are in formation. So that's about it. Right. Thanks.
So, in case you have questions, we're going to in-panel and take questions after my talk. So, I'll try to keep it as short as possible, but that's really hard for me. So, I apologize ahead of time. It is great to see all these folks here. There's a lot of people involved. The people that are standing here today are in the black letters, but there's a lot of people involved. And I want to talk about 2 new approaches for techniques to restore salt marsh following this agricultural legacy, the impacts on hydrology, what's happening with the sea level rise. So salt marshes, I don't know, you probably, this is, salt marsh 101, but, at a collegiate level, where, as Geoff was talking about, this fluid exchange systems coming in with the tidal creeks, and it's supporting all this great growth of plants. And even though there's very few plants that can survive there, they're very highly productive because they have adaptations for salinity and flooding a lot. And because of that, they need a lot of sunlight and they can grow really fast, but they're also very delicate and fragile. So this marsh actually will build in elevation, as we said before, with sea level rise. So as long as sea level is rising and the plants are happy and productive, and we get twice-a-day flooding with tides, that sediment will build up. And when you stop that, then the eroding processes start to take over and you get subsidence. And now we have sea level rise. And so we have sea level rise. So this is from Portland, Maine, but Boston looks pretty much the same. And each of those little blue dots is a month of mean sea level. I think I have mean sea level here. From 1912, I guess, all the way back to 1912. And you can see sea levels rising. There's some periods where it goes up pretty sharply. So here it went up pretty sharply. And this is 20 centimeters or 8 inches. This much rise is about 8 inches. So over the past century, sea level has risen about 8 inches, 20 centimeters, or 200 millimeters. If marshes grow at 2 millimeters a year, that's why it took 80 years for that to happen. Because at 2 millimeters a year times 80 years, you're going to get 160 millimeters. It's going to be a lot. But so we're in a period right now where Boston's the last 2 decades, we're only can hindcast sea level rise. That's why we can't tell you what sea level rise is going to be in 10 years. We can tell you what it was 15 years ago until 5 years ago. Until the data gets crunched. There's a process. So Boston's about 4 millimeters a year for the last from 5 years ago to 15 years ago. So it is going up a little faster. And so we have this pair of paradoxes. We know salt marshes have to flood with salt water. That salt water carries sediments. The marshes will build, so they need tidal flooding. But if they flood too much, it's going to drown them. So that's the soil waterlogging trajectory. And it drowns them, it kills the plants, the ground subsides, and you get problems. So we'll talk about one solution is runneling, or ditch plug removal, or ditch enhancement. So there's other things we can do. I'm going to talk about runneling today. The other problem is, what happened?
Sorry.
The other problem is salt marshes need to drain. They still need to drain, right? But if you drain it too much, oxygen gets in that peat. And when oxygen gets in the peat, it's just like taking one of our, which you don't have a wooden chair, but if you had a wooden pew and we burned it, what would be left? Ash. And the ash would just be the minerals that are left, right? Just the minerals, the nutrients. So all that would go in the air. So that's what's happening to our salt marshes. When we dig a lot of deep ditches, the air gets inside, the microbes burn off the carbon, and it falls in elevation. So you lose, that stuff goes off to the atmosphere. So that's the soil oxidation subside. So if you drain it too much, so it has to be drained, but if you drain it too much, it's bad too. So it's a Goldilocks thing, right? So the subsidence we have, Geoff has created a process where we can remediate ditches and let nature, work with nature to help nature to fill in the ditches that are too deep and too many to stop the subsidence from too much drainage. So we have too much flooding and too much drainage. So some spots in the marsh have too much flooding, some spots in the marsh have too much drainage. And so we can see this. My wife's warned me to tell you that you're not supposed to understand this. This is a joke slide. And I don't expect you to understand or see any of this stuff. So what we're going to look at is green and blue, and those are all the ditches, and then embankments again. But this is this is one section of a marsh that Geoff worked on, and this is in Essex, I believe. Yep, John Wise Lane. If you've been to the golf course, right here in Essex, that's it. So you can see it's a real mess, and sometimes they ditch two different directions just to drive us absolutely nuts. So we have areas that are way too wet, way too wet, way too wet. Areas that are way too drained, way too drained, way too drained, way too wet, way too wet. So we have these different spots on the marsh. So we can look at how to apply each of these techniques to get that marsh to be functioning a lot better. It's all about the hydrology and that fluid transfer system, which I've never heard about before. So it's fun to watch each other. What are they going to talk about this time? So this is our study site. This is Plum Island. So it's just a little bit north of here. We have different areas where we're working. And so what we did first was we just took a Philadelphia rod and a laser lever that you might have on a construction site, and that sends out a laser, and when it hits the marker, it makes a beep, and we can tell what the elevation of the land is. So we went across these ditches. So there's a bunch of ditches, and we decided to, well, I won't mention that yet. I'll get that in a second. We just took a survey across, and we could see that if this is the flat land, if there was no ditches at all here, this marsh was really flat, we'd expect it to be like this. So where the ditches are really close, we've lost about 20 centimeters in elevation. We kind of expect this to be up here, but it's all lost. And that's the high point, lost 20 centimeters. So again, that last 100 years of building and stuff, because these ditches are here, and these ditches are so deep, you can see how deep they are, actually the land has subsided now. And the solution is this ditch remediation concept. So here's our area, and the idea is to mow where the green lines are, and push the mowed hay, with the arrows showing pushing the hay, into these red dotted lines, and these are the ditches that we don't want. So some ditches we don't want, some we do. So we want to get rid of this ditch, and this ditch, and this ditch. We're going to keep this ditch, and this ditch, and this ditch. And then this ditch, we're going to keep that ditch. But we're going to get rid of all the other ditches and let the natural flow, this is a natural, probably a natural creek, although what we've learned now is there's very few natural creeks left, but the really bigger ones are a little bit like that. So, mow the grass, you're there, you get a mower out there, a special mower, you mow the grass, put the grass in the ditch, and you'll fix it with twine. And what happens is, the sediments come and they fill up that grass with mud, and the spartina is going to grow in it, and it's going to make it peat. So it's not like you have a ditch with all of a sudden it's a different material, like a sand in it, where the water would be flowing in and out. It would be easily to erode anyway. So now you're going to have a peat, and the old ditch is going to be filled with peat, and then you're going to have a new ditch. So The idea is to let nature do that. And it might take 2 or 3 times. So here's our cross section. And here's one of the ones, here's one that we kept as a ditch. And you can see from 1 year to the next, this is over a course of what, 3 or 4 years, this ditch stays pretty much the same depth. Here's a ditch we treated, or Geoff treated, and it used to be this deep, and now it's gone up 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 centimeters shallower. So it's gone from this depth to this depth. So about 18 centimeters, or 50 centimeters, about 18 inches shallower. So it's healed the ditch from the bottom up. If we look at what's growing in the ditch, we can see this is the untreated ditch, and this is a treated ditch. Now some spots don't vegetate right away from one reason or another. So I took a photograph here because you can see my quadrats here to count stems and to look at percent cover. And it's absolutely 0 in this case because there's variation in nature. But you can see right down here it's all closed off. So if my transect line, which is predetermined, fell over there, I'd have a high number, but it fell over here, so I have a low number. But all in all, you can see that these are the treated ditches in the black, and it went from about 10% cover to 25% cover over the course of just 2 years. And the blue are the untreated ditches. They have a few stems in them, but it doesn't change. Now we can look at this overall with just a photograph, right? Because ultimately, a lot of groups like you, when you're doing monitoring in the field, you don't do the detailed stuff like I do with the transects and surveys and stuff. So what you can do is just take photographs and just go back to the same exact place. So Greg Moore took this photograph, came back the next year, took a photograph, came back the next year, and pretty much you can see this is sort of healed. It's healed up. So the water still goes in and out a little bit, but not as much, and it doesn't drain out. So hopefully it's going to be building up elevation much faster. This is the untreated ditch. You can see it's here. You can see it's still here. This is August, so the grass is all growing, but it's still a ditch, and the other is gone. So now I want to switch over to the waterlogging megapool issue. So this is a 2-well drained ditch remediation. Don't do every ditch. You have to decide which ditches are going to be your hydrologic paths, because we don't want to start recreating the whole hydrology in the marsh. We don't have much. No one has enough money for that. We recognize that. So use the ditches, but not have so many ditches. Okay, so this is Belle Isle. I just took this off the Google Earth Pro yesterday, 2 days ago when I was preparing this talk. So remember there's embankments and clogged ditches over time. And that's those legacy agricultural effects of interacting with sea level rise to form these megapools. And so we have this clear embankment system right here in your marsh. It turns a 90-degree corner, goes over here, and then there's another embankment system that goes down here, and you're getting megapools. And when these fill up with algae, bad things, they tend to expand as well. You have all kinds of problems here. Here's one of these, this is just totally embanked in a ridiculous fashion for a radio station or something. And then somebody broke it through, or is it natural? What do you guys? Natural.
That was a World War II emplacement, I was told. It's
Okay.
kind of observation post to the coast.
So this broke through.
There was a culvert there.
Okay, that makes sense. It broke through. And you can see it's all unvegetated now, right? Or it's slowly going to vegetate. But it's all low marsh. So you've lost the high marsh there. So there's no sparrows can breed over here. They all would die because they'd make the nest and the tide would come in and the chicks would die. So they're not breeding there. So we have to be careful with how we approach this so that we don't get areas that aren't going to be rehabilitated to areas where sparrows can breed. So, okay, so let's go to the next one. So there's a cycle. Once these pools start to form, algae grows over the pools, and this is a photograph of the edge of a pool where the wind has blown the algae all over the marsh surface. So you can see it's really dense thicknesses here. It kills the plants. The plants die, the roots collapse. The nutrients, there's lots of nutrients in salt marshes, and when the plants aren't taking them up, they're all released. And when the nutrients are released, what grows? The algae. So then you're back and you have this cycle of algae, goes over the edge, kills the plants die, the pool gets bigger, nutrients all go to the pool, get more algae. So there's a cycle here, so we have to try to get rid of this cycle. So the best thing we can do is try to make a shallow drainage system. So not a drainage system that's going to go 2 or 3 feet that's going to cause oxidation, but a shallow drainage path to get the water off the marsh. And so we just created this little runnel. It's 8 to 10 inches wide. It's about 10 inches deep. With this little rod here, we just pressure, bang it through. And the idea is to establish this flow path to drain this mega pool, stop the expansion cycle. We also planted alternate flora to test that out. And we monitored tidal hydrology and plots and stuff like that. So the first image is tidal hydrology. So this is a control pool. This is a natural pool in the marsh. You can see it's filled with water, and then the spring tides come, the really big tides. You can see the high tide comes up and down a couple of 5 or 10 inches or so. The pool with a runnel, because now it has a runnel and it drains, we weren't getting this before, but 2 or 3 days or 4 or 5 days, twice a month, the pool edges would dry off and then plants could get started there. So we'll see what happened with the plants. And so we had 2 different pools. We have the north pool and the south pool. And these are histograms. So this is showing the cover, the amount of cover of Spartina alterniflora, low marsh plants, high marsh plants. And the pool is blue, and the edge of the pool is green. And so in the north pool, we get, in the north pool with Spartina, we're getting a lot more Spartina growth growing into the pool. And then it sort of stops here, but it's just a, well, it's a little detail which we can go into some other time. The edge of the pool with the salt marsh grasses at the pool, into the pool, these salt marsh high grasses are starting to come into the pool, so the Spartina patens. The ones that the birds like to nest in. And the ones at the edge of the pool have gotten actually a lot healthier. The south pool is the same story with the Spartina alterniflora growing into the pool. And it's actually leaving the edge because the edge is really being dominated by the high marsh grasses. So we got Disticulus and patens this tall, which is probably maybe too tall for the sparrows to be living in, but they can be living at the edge. They like to fly into there, put their nest right in there, and then fly out, and then no one will know where they are. So this is really working out well. And one extra there. So we planted some plants here just to see if we needed to plant plants. You can see that we probably didn't need to plant plants because they're growing out, but our plants, you can plant plants if you want to. And this is one of the pools. It was 8 acres in size. This pool was one of the biggest pools I know of. But it's a mega pool, and it's going to connect to this mega pool, and it's going to get bigger and bigger over time. So after our runnel, it took 5 years, and now we have the pools. A bunch of pools are still here. There's about 6 or 7 pools, depending on how you count. So there's good pools for ducks still, but there's a lot of vegetation coming in. So I think it's quite successful. So there's 2 different methods: ditch remediation for overdrained areas, and runnels for the overflooded areas. Thanks.
Negative impact, whether it's intended or unintended, that may be happening right now. I'm thinking, for example, stormwater that may be coming onto the marsh and changing its salinity from upstream, whether it's because there's development with non-permeable surface or whatever reason, or maybe more storm because of climate change.
That's a really great question. My old boss used to say that salt marshes are downstream of everybody. So that if you're really looking for the long-term health of the salt marsh, you have to look at the watershed too. And so, stormwater management would be a vital part of protecting the downstream salt marshes. And as you know, if you freshen a marsh, you're likely to get the invasive Phragmites and or other plants that just don't build peat as well. So I would say, you really need to. So what happened to rainfall before people paved things over? The rainwater went down into the ground and recharged the groundwater table, which would then recharge the streams and take the fresh water out to the coast. And so that's like the most natural pathway, and if we can restore that pathway, then we're doing good. Otherwise, if you've got a pipe discharging right on the edge of the marsh, sort of in my estimation, I would want to move that fresh water out of the marsh as quickly as possible, and not just have it dump onto the marsh surface in a big puddle.
So, more trees, because in the forest, 1/3 of the water from rainfall gets re-evaporated, never hits the ground. More infiltration areas, rooftop gardens, all those things will reduce the amount of water going directly to the surface of the marsh, will drive that water into the water table or back in the atmosphere.
And every home can have a little corner of a rain garden where your downspout comes. And so you could, you know, plant some plants that are adapted to having their feet wet a little bit of the time, and just, you know, accept that water into your yard, you know, in a healthy way. Got a couple of questions still in the back. I see, but just want to take from.
I was going to ask, when you do the remediation and the runoffs, do you have to go through an elaborate permit process with the government and the federal and local regulations?
If you move the sediment, yes, so I'll hand it to Jeff.
I'm not sure I'm the right person to take this, but yes, we need to go through the full permitting process for everything. They sort of view, even though it's the grass is existing there, put the grass and regenerate saltmarsh peat in the channels, it's still considered fill by some of the permitting agencies, not all of them. So we're still trying to work on that. And as far as other techniques, so with runoffs and things, we're excavating and handling fill, so that would you know, warrant a permit. And then we're also, depending on what the permitting agency is, they have different views about us. We use the fill in beneficial ways. We shouldn't call it fill. We use the material that we excavate as we create a runoff in beneficial ways. The way that we're focusing on right now, this is actually going to be our focus the next couple of years, really fine-tuning how we do this, is in a manner called microtopography, and that's to create basically nesting islands or areas that are slightly elevated above that will serve as breeding refugia for saltmarsh sparrows. So the goal, our recovery sort of strategy, is to keep saltmarsh sparrows in the landscape for long enough for the plants to essentially grow the elevation of the marsh up to where it should be relative to sea levels. And so by using the spoils to all these bad terms that we have lingering from the past, by using the materials generated during the restoration process for a beneficial use of creating these saltmarsh sparrow breeding habitats, then that's a big part of the plan. And I guess what I'm stumbling about is that there's some research up in Maine that shows that there's a 50% increase in nest survival with just 5 centimeters higher in the marsh.
That's 2 inches for us.
Yeah.
Normal people.
So it's a really fine line that if we can create, talk about a project, so we've got one project that's sort of in the planning process right now, and through the combined use of ditch remediation and runoffs, there'll be a total generation of about 1,000 cubic yards of material over 150 acres. So what that means, if we're using approximately 1 to 1.5 cubic yards of material per island, so there's going to be 800, approximately 800 additional nest sites available on that 150 acres for saltmarsh sparrows. And we'll choose locations where the sparrows want to be. So the sparrows have a spatial relationship with the marsh. If you're all familiar with the marsh, you know that there's areas that farmers used to call the high meadows. So that's the upper portions of the marsh. May only get flooded 5 or 6 times in a season. The next area down, where they had the larger embankments, those were called the inner marshes. And so they had to do more to close the tide out of those areas, so they had higher embankments. And then the furthest ones out were called the outer marshes. And Belle has examples of all of this. And so the sparrows really want to breed in the high meadows areas, and that's where we find the populations now. They can breed on the embankments and other areas. We found, evidence of that as well.